I'm author Nic Stone, and I am here to moderate This American Life 2.0. We're doing this a little bit differently tonight. So if the five of you lovely, amazing human beings and epic writers would tell us who you are and what book you are here to promote. Bill.
Oh, me. Hi, I am Bill Konigsberg, and I'm here to promote the upcoming The Bridge. The Bridge is coming out September 1st, and it is about a boy and a girl who meet on top of the George Washington Bridge in New York City. They're both there to jump, and they interrupt each other. The moment that they are sitting 100 feet apart from each other with one leg over the ledge each, the world actually splits into 4 different realities. And there are so 4 stories in a row. And in the first one, the girl jumps. In the second, the boy jumps. In the third, they both jump. And in the fourth, they both live. And they decide not to jump. And so this is really a book about those moments in our lives. I've had them. I've dealt with suicidal depression a long time, most of my life. Those moments in our lives where we feel like our lives don't matter and it wouldn't matter if we were gone. So that's my book.
Natasha.
I'm Natasha Díaz, and I'm here to talk about Color Me In, which is a coming-of-age novel about a biracial Jewish white-presenting teen, Nevaeh Levitt, who is dealing with her parents' divorce and having to go between the affluent suburb she grew up in and her mother's family home in Harlem. And she's having to figure out where she fits between her 2 worlds and find her voice, and is also being forced to have a belated bat mitzvah.
George.
My book is All Boys Aren't Blue, which comes out on Tuesday.
Yay!
A young adult Black queer memoir chronicling my age from age 5 to 21, and it discusses my journey through figuring out my queerness. At the age of 5, I was already having thoughts and already starting to process sexuality. And so not only do you get my experiences in the book, I think you get something even more important, which is what was going on in my mind. And I think it'll be, and it's a book that also talks about the nuclear Black family and how my Black family was much different in terms of how they affirmed who I was and how they supported me. And although it didn't stop some of the traumas that happened, there was also a lot of Black joy within my growing up experience.
Fabulous. Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. I am here to talk about my debut YA novel called Don't Ask Me Where I'm From.
Hey, debut. George too, debut.
This tells the story of Liliana Cruz, who's 15 years old, and she's part of a desegregation program in Boston. And so she takes a bus for an hour every day to a new school, a high school. She's trying to fit in. And meanwhile, her father's missing, but she realizes he isn't missing, he's been deported to Guatemala. And she didn't even realize her parents were undocumented. So she's got this whole coming of age among this backdrop of just kind of figuring out her family's immigration story. And I'm also the editor of this anthology called Wise Latinas, and it's a collection of essays written by different Latino writers reflecting on the college experience.
And Ms. Thomas, that's a fascinating background you got there.
Yeah, those are the writers of the canon, you know, the white men who've written all the books for certain demographics to see themselves in and shape the view of America as we know it before for a long, long time in publishing. Anyway, I'm Angie Thomas. I'm the author of, I'm most known for The Hate You Give, but I'm also the author of On the Come Up, which is now being blurred out by the white man in the back. That's okay.
It's shiny.
It's shiny. Yeah, this is the shiny special collector's edition that keeps getting erased. But anyway, it's about a 16-year-old girl named Brianna who wants to be a rapper, and her life is turned upside down when a song she makes goes viral for all the wrong reasons, and she finds herself in the center of a controversy that's too big for her to control. It's a story about what it means to speak up and speak out, even when other people don't like the way you say things. And it's a look at what it means to be young and Black in America when freedom of speech isn't necessarily free.
Boom. So this panel is about, it's called This American Life. And a theme that exists in at least one of all of your books is this idea of having to morph and mold oneself in order to fit different places. Angie, Jen, and Natasha, you both have these narratives where you have a character who is living basically two different existences in two different spaces. George, in your book, we learn about how you, as like a person that we can see and talk to, have had to exist differently and bend and mold yourself to fit different spaces. And then Bill, the book that I think of when I'm thinking about this particular topic is Openly Straight, and how you have a kid who has this part of his identity that he doesn't want anybody to know about. So he goes a different direction. How do you guys think this idea of having to fit different spaces speaks to what it means to be American? That's for like all of y'all.
I'll go first. Like what it's like, even like when I hear like the term American, like I've never felt American. So like I know like I'm listed as African American, but that's just like a qualifier, I guess. Like, you know, which is why I identify as Black. That's why my shirt says your reminder to capitalize the B in Black, because some of us call ourselves Black as our identifier and not just African American. So for me, I think like to be American is like to be like, I guess like my total self when I show up in spaces. Like I don't just show up as a Black person. I don't just show up as a queer person. I am a Black queer person and I show up in all of those spaces that way. Mm-hmm. I think the denial of that is unfortunately what it is to be American at this point. I think to be American is to be like, it's like the denial of the existence of other people who aren't cis, white, in particular, like male. You know, the depictions of Americanness have always been what, the white picket fence, the house, 2.3 kids, a dog. I don't know what the 0.3 is, but it's always 2.3 kids, dog, like however they figured it all out. But I think, you know, for this panel and for all of us, like our existence is just not, it's like everything anti-American is my existence. And I am fine and I'm happy and I'm proud to be the descendant of a slave. And I think that is my America, is like teaching my people to be proud that we came from slavery, not to be shamed by it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said, George, and I totally relate. And I think my character, the main character, Liliana, can relate in that, you know, she goes on this journey from being ashamed of her background and her situation, especially with her father being deported, to coming to an understanding, really for the first time, that her story is part of a larger story. And her parents didn't just up and fall from the sky and land in Boston. Like there's a reason that they're there, and they're from somewhere, and their family is from somewhere, and so on. And so I think that journey of going from A to Z, I mean, it's a long one and it's complicated, but it's a beautiful journey. And I can certainly relate, because for me, like the modern American experience as it relates to my character too, is that it's just wearing a lot of hats, like constantly, like, and switching them, like caps for sale, kind of, you got tons of caps and you're just switching them all over the place. And that's what it means, I think, to be a modern American. And for Liliana, she's like that in the book. I really try to show her with her family, with her best friend, with her new best friend, with her teachers. Like she's just constantly code switching. So that's what I think the modern American experience is.
You know, growing up gay in the 1980s was a very different experience than it is now. So my teenage experience was simply not fitting in, that who I was supposed to be wasn't who I was, and the pain that is associated with that. That's something I know well. It's been really an interesting journey, because I mean, I look right now at the intersections of my personality, my labels. And so I have a lot of different labels, and I have watched the gay movement in a way where, I mean, marriage equality, that wasn't something we thought about in the 1980s, but suddenly here it is. I have watched my acceptance level as a gay, white, cis male changed significantly. But I consider myself a conscientious objector. I mean, I see and I understand what it felt like. And that's why I started writing the books I do.
Yeah, I can relate a lot to what George said in the beginning. I've never thought of myself as an American. First of all, I'm a New Yorker. So that's number one. Number two is what my life has looked like has always been a wild blend of people. My mother is a first generation American. Her parents were from Brazil and Liberia, respectively. So, you know, her life in America was molded by immigrants who didn't grow up here. And that trickled down to how I was then raised. My father is like a fourth generation White Plains Jew, and culturally, like, that was also brought in then into the mix. And so it's New York also for me is city specifically. I grew up in the city. That is what I know as home, as America to me. I don't know how to drive. I will never be behind the wheel of a car. You don't want me doing that. So it's like I am very limited in where I can be and where I go and what feels like home, which is in this country. And so for me, that's how I want to portray young people's stories, because at least growing up in New York, a lot of my friends had families with very similar backgrounds, and that was what I knew. And I've never understood why in media, whether it's books, TV, movies, families, that everyone always looks the same, everyone sounds the same, and that I've never known that. So I want to continue to portray this version of what America has always been to me.
Love it. So, Jennifer, I'm going to jump to you. Your book, Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, comes out May 5th, yes?
So it's now bumped to August 4th.
Okay, love it. So everybody go pre-order Don't Ask Me Where I'm From. It is fantastic. Something I would love for you to touch on that you actually... So Natasha just mentioned that her mother is a first generation American, which is a thing for Liliana in this book. Yeah. When you think about the idea of immigration, how is being a first generation American different from A, being an immigrant, and B, being a person whose parents were first generation or second generation?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, I think the answer to that question is a body of work, but I think that in this particular story and in the context of my own life, it matters. It matters whether you're an immigrant or first generation or second generation. And for Liliana being first generation, it means on a practical level that she has to do a whole lot of explaining. And that was my experience. It still is. You're just constantly, she's explaining things to her mother. And then she's explaining things to her friends, like why she can't sleep over and why they can't why she can't just go over their house like that. Like she has to ask her mother. They're like, what? Why do you have to ask your mother? She can't have a boyfriend. So her boyfriend doesn't know that she's hiding him. All these kinds of things. She has to constantly explain, and it's exhausting, but it's also material for art and stories, right? And I mean, I remember even in my own life to this day, like explaining to my parents who are immigrants from Guatemala. I mean, they're citizens. They've been living in the United States. This is actually the 50th year anniversary of them living in the US. But I remember when I first started working on a novel, my mom kept asking me questions, and I admit I was like answering her like, oh, come on, like, and then finally she said, look, how many pages is a novel? And I told her, I don't know, maybe between 300 to 400 pages, just to give her an answer. And then she got quiet, and then she's like, okay, what page are you on? And it's like she really wanted to know, like, what page I'm on, when am I going to be done, and how many more pages does she have to sit out for until she can go to a bookstore and buy my book. And part of me is like, I could be bothered by that, but it's also, it adds texture to life, and it gives all these kind of milestones more oomph, more vida. I just think that having to explain isn't always a bad thing. I think we're making big movements and bridges from one generation to the next. And I know my son's going to be they're going to be explaining things to me. So I guess we all have to get used to it.
Love. Angie, so in
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
This is
I
my
haven't
better
seen
half.
you in forever.
Like a whole 12 hours.
Like, I mean, Dumbledore and Snape took over our cameras, so.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So on the come up, we get this really searing look at American poverty. And something I find interesting about the concept of poverty and how poverty affects people of color, specifically Black and brown people, Black and Latinx people, to a greater extent than it does white people. And I also find it interesting that the people that poverty affects the most are also the people most often called unpatriotic. So I want to hear from you how you feel about the notion of people who are impoverished being called unpatriotic and how you think that relates to their poverty.
I think it's unfair to expect anyone to be patriotic for a country that and love a country that doesn't necessarily show them love back. That's like telling someone, I hurt you all the time, but you better love me. You know, I'm not doing it. I talk down on you all the time. I see you as less than all the time, but you got to see me as great. And that's an unfair expectation. I'm looking now at the pandemic, and we see the numbers show that Black and brown people in impoverished communities are being affected more. And why is that? Because we're talking about resources that have not been in communities and have not been made available to people from the get-go. If nothing else, this pandemic is revealing that our country does not take care of our poor people. We walk by them, we ignore them, we tell them pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and we're talking about a lot of times people who don't even have boots. And that's what I wanted to show with On the Come Up. You can't expect somebody to pull themselves up by a bootstrap they don't have. And even the fact that I had Bree want Timberland boots so bad, for me, that was a metaphor for this whole idea of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, the boots that she's wearing, the fake Timbs she's wearing before this, they're falling apart. There's nothing she can pull herself up by in the beginning, from the get-go. And then she has to all of a sudden sell out, become someone she's not, and play into this role that's being placed on her by society in order to even get some boots. So we have an issue in this country, and we have an issue with expecting more from poor people than we give them back. And through my work, I wanted to show that. Through Bree's story, I wanted to show that, but I also wanted to show there's so many different ways that poverty looks. And Americans, we have it bad. We think, oh, it's not so bad over here, especially if you're in some kind of socioeconomic privilege. Oh, poverty is not so bad. You see how it is over in the third world countries. They got it good here. But we have kids right now who aren't eating. Yeah. We have kids right now who they're supposed to be learning at home, and they don't even have computers at home or internet access at home, but we expect more of them. So if nothing else, as a writer, I want to reveal that we're not as great as we want to think we are, and we have so much more to do, and we're failing those people amongst us who are the most vulnerable.
Whew. All right.
I love you.
I'm like out on my porch and it's like 60 degrees and I'm sweating. It's very to me right now. Tasha, I'm after you now, girl.
Okay.
So in Color Me In, one of my favorite things about Nevaeh is that as over the course of the novel, she has to learn how to kind of speak up for herself. But I think this gives us an entryway to talk about how people who are marginalized, people who live on the margins, we are conditioned to keep quiet and to not make waves, which interestingly enough is kind of anti-American. So what about American life contributes to self-censorship from people who live on the margins?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about originally about how we've sort of all had to shape our own version of America because we don't fit into the mold that it was started with, right? And so I think with Nevaeh specifically, she has been she had been raised her whole life up until the point we meet her in the book in this affluent white-washed suburb where she, for the most part, like looked like she fit in, even though people knew that her family was interracial, but she could sort of just pass it off and not really talk about it and not engage with her Black identity. And that was encouraged because it made it easier, right? Like as long as she was quiet in the corner and she was, you know, she was like not white, but she was white enough to make it not a thing for them, that she didn't have to deal with it herself. And then when she has to split time in Harlem with her mom's family, they're like, oh no, like if you're going to be a part of this family and this community, like you don't get to ignore that. You don't get to ignore the way that you are a part of this community, or even if you're going to be on the outskirts of it, if you're not going to engage, you don't get to ignore that. And what I think it does is it causes waves in her former home life, right? It causes waves for her father and in his ingrained biases that he has, because unfortunately for people who don't know, mixed people don't save racism, don't fix racism. White people can marry and have children with a person of color and still be racist. All of these things happen and are happening in American families today at the dinner table. We need to talk about it. And so she comes home and she's talking about it, and she's like, I'm Black, like that is part of who I am, and he doesn't want to hear that. And so all of those things, her speaking out, it's ripping apart the America, the person that she was built to be, and then she has to piece herself back together. And I think a lot of young people, when you come from multiracial, multi-ethnic, interfaith families, I think you have to do that, especially if there isn't a good form of communication between family members. Because I know in my sides of my family, like on my mom's side specifically, they didn't talk about emotions at all. Like it's my generation and my cousins where we've been like having to pull it out of our aunts and uncles and parents. Like we have to talk about these things. And I think it's like the new America is hopefully what we're writing toward, and the people that we are writing for.
Y'all are just so full of like wisdom and magic. I'm loving it. Bill, so I'm really excited to read The Bridge, first of all. Like I cannot wait. I love your work and I cannot wait to read this. It does seem though like it stands a bit apart from a Bill Konigsberg, what we're used to from Bill Konigsberg. So you're dealing a lot more with mental health, with depression, with loneliness. And there's obviously a reason that you decided to write this book. What bothers you about the way mental health is handled in America?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it makes me think of really what Angie was just saying about that bootstrap mentality, because there's this idea like this American grittiness and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What if your brain doesn't work the way that your brain is quote unquote supposed to work? And that's definitely how it has been for me. And frankly, I think the reason in some ways, and by the way, there is still a queer character in this book, but the reason that I'm switching up in some ways is because I feel like it's time for me in some ways to come out about this, come out. Part of my identity is that I suffer from chronic depression. And that is something that is true, and it's something I'm not supposed to say. We have a lot of people who are really weird about that, and we don't have ongoing conversation about these things. And of course, the silence about that is absolutely deadly. So that's why I'm writing what I'm writing. And the hope really is to get a sense that we can all discuss these issues, because I really want on Twitter for something to start here. We're going to use this hashtag, which is Stay Another Day for the Bridge. And the idea, I will tell you, and I mean, just I had a hard day today. I am dealing with some depression right now, and some of it is situational because of the virus, and some of it is brain stuff. And so I needed to think today about, the things I'm writing in this book, which is just sometimes we just have to realize that the day is a tough one and just stay with us. So that's my hope here.
Please stay, because we need you for all the books. Like, give us all of the amazing Bill Konigsberg books. They're so
Thank
good.
you.
George, my boo. So I had the pleasure of meeting George at the North Texas Teen Book Festival in March, and I was supposed to be hosting his launch in a few days. And you're the only person on this panel who wrote something nonfiction. And I think that that's a really important thing, especially when we think about how books are tools of empathy. I've heard your book described as a primer for teens eager to be allies. And as America is this land of difference, in your opinion, how does one become an effective ally to people who have areas of privilege or people who have areas of marginalization different than they do?
Yeah, so, well, one, like, I don't like the word ally. So, like, it's something that I'm also removing from, like, my vocabulary with a lot of other words. Because a lot of times ally means, like, a mutual exchange. And, like, sometimes people need to be protecting us because they need to protect us. Like, I have nothing to give you. I think Angie kind of hit the nail on the head. It's like, I'm poor, I have nothing to give you. You should be still doing this thing for me. So I'm very big on, like, teaching advocacy and, like, what advocacy looks like. Outside of, like, this whole idea of, like, well, I'm an ally, because I feel like a lot of times allies start to center themselves when you check them. And, like, that's when you really realize, like, oh, you really aren't an ally. But I do think that people can become better advocates by, number one, realizing that, like, even some of us who deal with oppression all the time, like I deal with oppression, I still have more privilege than a trans person. And that is just something that I know, right? Like, I know that oftentimes my existence isn't threatened when I walk out of my home. My existence isn't threatened inside my home. And that there are a lot of people who who never get away from abuse. And so for me, it's like, even though I am oppressed and I am marginalized in many ways, I still have privilege in areas that I can help and protect somebody else, and that I can advocate on behalf of someone else. And it's like, if I can do it with someone who identifies as Black and non-binary, then cis hetero people can also do this too. I think oftentimes what we run into is a problem where people will say, like, oh, well, like, you're putting your gender first, or you're putting your sex first, right? And that's why you have so many people who attack feminism. And that's why you have so many people who attack us, who talk about homophobia and transphobia and any other ism and phobia. And it's like, realistically for me, like, I exist around Black people. Like, I grew up with Black people, my family is Black people, my community is Black people. So when I'm with Black people, my othering is my gender. My othering is my sexuality. So those are the things I have to be loudest about, because I have to get my own community on board to understand that. Now, when we are going against the community that sits above us, I just hit my hat, the community that sits above us, then yes, we will be on the same lines of, like, we are Black first, because when we enter those spaces, we are Black first. And so with the book, it was important that I wanted people to start to take a moment to step back and think about the classmate that sits next to them that's really quiet, or think about the classmate that sits in the back of the classroom that may be a little effeminate, and really start to realize, outside of their own bubble of hetero norms and heterosexism and all of the things that we're conditioned to be, to think about what that other person may be going through. I think we're more alike than we are different. And I hope that the book lets people know that, yeah, I used to double dutch, but I also played football. Like, we're more alike than we are different. And I hope that the book lets people know, like, I was a lot of things, and I was sassy, but I also did many of the same things that all of y'all did. And I had heterosexual cousins and friends and brothers and family members that were all around me, and it all worked. And so you don't have to think that it doesn't work.
Beautiful answer. Speaking of family, I remember back when the marriage equality bill was basically at the Supreme Court, there was this uproar about basically this notion of the erosion of the American family, which is poppycock. But in every single one of y'all's books, family is such a vital piece of identity formation. So if you could all just take a second to speak on that and speak on why you think the different forms of family, the different shapes and molds that family takes in your books. There are single parent families. There are families that are divorced, that are families that are led by a matriarch, like a grandmother. How does family affect the way we develop?
I can go first. So one of my favorite parts of Color Me In are the side characters, are the family members. And specifically because, you know, Nevaeh, she's an only child. She has her parents, and neither of her parents are really there for her at this point in her life. They're both consumed with the divorce and with the things that are happening as a result of that. And so she's getting to know her mom's family, her cousins, and her aunt and uncle and her grandfather, who she's really not spent a lot of time with. And I myself am an only child. I'm an only child of divorce. And I grew up with my cousins, and those are my siblings. And that's not like a question. It's just how I was raised. And I feel very fortunate to have always had these external people who aren't necessarily in my home all the time, who I know are still my immediate family that I can go to. And it's, again, like what I said in the beginning when you asked about how to define America, that's what the American family looks like to me. And we walk down the street still, and, you know, people still, I don't understand why it's anyone's business, but people still get so confused when we say we're cousins, like they don't understand how that could be because we look so different. But it's never, it's something that even as a small child, when I first started to realize, like, oh, I look different than most of the people in my family, but that doesn't change the fact that they're my family. It's something that I've had to understand with more nuance as I've gotten older, but it's never been a situation where I've looked and been like, oh, okay, like maybe we, you know, don't fit the mold, and so we don't really count as family, or people get to sort of negate our closeness or our bond because we experience the world differently. Like in fact, I think we enhance each other's experiences because we walk through it differently. And that's what makes us closer. And then we're also able to call each other out on our nonsense as a result of that. And that to me is what family is and does.
I can relate to that on so many levels, Natasha. I love that. In Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, you know, Liliana's father is missing for the majority of the book. He's gone. He's off the page. But she thinks about him a lot, and she recalls memories, and she's just constantly trying to get him back. And right now, so many families are separated through detention at the border, and so many families have been separated because of deportation. And so this is a huge reality for so many teens right now, like all over. And Liliana is experiencing that again among this, like, the whole backdrop of just regular teen drama. But you know, I'm not speaking for every Latinx person in the world, but I will say that for this character in the book, family is huge for her. It's critical. Like, she defines herself within her family unit, even though they're separated at the current in the current story. What's interesting, I think, is that her parents are the ones who signed her up for this desegregation program years ago, like way back when, and she had no idea. And so she gets into this program. She doesn't want to do it because she's like, what do you mean? I like my high school. I'm in Boston. I'm not trying to leave all my friends. And her mom tells her, no, you're doing it. And she's like, oh man, you know, I wish dad was here. And then her mom's like, your dad's the one who signed you up, so be quiet, you know. And she's like, what? So I think a lot of times people move to this country, they want better for their kids. I know my parents did, and they wanted us to have a degree and a house, and anything after that was extra. Like, they were not like, you're gonna get married and have kids and all that stuff. So I grew up a little differently in that way. But with Liliana, her parents just push education, education, education. And so her father is present in a way that he might not be there physically, but he's very present in decisions that they're shaping her day-to-day life. And then her aunt and uncle come to visit from Guatemala and help out with the family. And at first, you know, she's like, oh my God, I have to like share the one bathroom in our apartment, and, you know, typical maybe teen reaction. But then she learns a lot from them, and she gets to understand more about her family's story. And I just think that teens need more of that opportunity. I mean, they're inheriting a story. This generation of young Americans are inheriting basically all of history, all of American history. And we need to help them process that and digest that and make meaning of that. And what better way than through stories?
Oh, I guess for me, family is everything. And so like in my book, I do have the Black woman matriarch, and my grandmother, who we call Nanny. She was extremely important in terms of like the fact that I feel like the only real depiction we ever get of like the Black grandmother is like Big Mama from Soul Food. Also kind of like maybe Medea, maybe Minnie from The Help. Like, you know, like there are kind of like these depictions of the Black matriarch, but they've only like kind of been blips in other stories. Like there hasn't been like a centering of like how that woman ended up raising a generation of people. I think, especially when you talk about Black people, like we were going through two epidemics at the same time. So we were going through an HIV epidemic as well as a crack epidemic. And I think a lot of people don't talk about how, because we were going through two epidemics at the same time, you had grandmothers who ended up raising a lot of grandchildren. And that's still something that we see in our community today. And so my story, although my mom and my dad were very present in my life and are still present in my life and still married, they both worked. And so we went to my grandmother's house every day. And so I often talk about like just some of the things she did just to instill like these values in us that weren't built in coddling of us as boys. And like we had to clean up every Saturday, like me and my younger brother and my two cousins, who all basically stayed together with her throughout the week and on the weekends. We had to clean every Saturday. We went on vacation every year. And she used to tell us like how like Black kids, like how we had privilege, that she always made sure that we left our state, and how so many kids that we knew never got to leave the city or never left the state. And so like we grew up with like that type of like teaching and understanding from a woman who, you know, technically never really graduated high school herself. And, you know, back then it was like, you didn't have to graduate high school to become a nurse. And it was like, you know, it's like, it was just different things and different times back then. And so like, she was just this woman who not only was battling cancer, but still like gave so much of herself that she really didn't leave much for herself. And I think that ended up kind of being like one of the downfalls in the end when she finally got sick a year and a half ago. And, you know, she just, again, I think it's like, my book is like a lot of lessons around like the wisdom of older Black women, and how like even all these years later and all these generations later, whether you look at the Mamie depiction, whether you look at depictions of us from 1619, like the Black woman was still like the center of like how birth happened, how things moved and how things grew, and just how like the Black family and the image of a Black anything stayed together for all of these centuries. And so I'm just kind of very proud that in getting to tell my story, I'm also getting to tell her story, as well as the story of like the Black women in my family, because they're all very important to me, especially because she was the first person who saw what I was before I even knew what I was.
You know, that thing about the, you know, when you're talking about marriage equality and, you know, it's hurting the American family, you know, the way I've always looked at that and where all of these books are going, what it does is it degrades the myth of the American family, because of course, that was never the case. You know, American families have always been, you know, diverse in many different ways. And, you know, I grew up in a time, again, God, I always feel like I'm the old man because I am, but you know, grew up in a time we had one television show with a Black family in the 1980s. You know, that's what I grew up with. We grew up with no gay characters on television. And so when conservatives talk about, you know, what you're doing to the American family, what they're talking about is we're changing the story, and that upsets them. Just our presence upsets them. And I do think, you know, that for my sake and for what I write, I always want to challenge that in one way or another with the families that I create. And so that's no different in The Bridge. The families are not traditional. Anyhow, that's all I got.
I love you. No, but one interesting thing that happened for me was when I wrote The Hate You Give, I had a lot of white people who came to me and they were like, and I'm so glad that Star has both her parents in the book. Now, the optics of that, when I hear it from, I'll just be honest, when I hear it from my Black readers, you know, it comes from a place of, thank you for this, because we're so used to people acting as if Black fathers don't exist. But who says it makes a difference? Because when I have an older white reader tell me that, it's as if to say, oh, this is a unicorn. And it's not. So when I wrote On the Come Up, a lot of On the Come Up was written rebelliously. Everything that I thought people loved about The Hate You Give, I wanted to say, nope, not doing it. So I purposely gave Bree a single mom, but also she has her grandparents who are just as important and are parents in their own way to her. And then there's her older brother who, in a way, is a parent also. Because for so many kids, that is a reality, and that doesn't make their family any less legit than anyone else's. Their family matters just as much as anyone else's. And that's something that I think as authors, you know, we have a responsibility in shaping the view of the next generation and helping them realize that there is no default. There's no default family. Families don't look a certain way. All families are going to be different, and that's totally fine. There's no default family. And I'm going to challenge that in every single way that I can through my writing. So like I'm working on my third book now, and it's Maverick, and he has his mom, and it's them, but also he has his cousin and aunts and grandparents. So he has a different looking family than what people want to say is the default. Then I'm working on a middle grade novel. Well, this character is dealing with parents who are divorced, because guess what? There are kids who do. So I think that this idea of the quote unquote American family is something that we as authors will have to continue to challenge and challenge the fact that there is no default, just as we do with books and these characters that we write. White should not be the default, straight should not be the default, cis should not be the default. There is no default, and we continue to challenge that.
Mm-hmm. Shout out to Becky Albertalli. That is a
yes, exactly. That is such a Becky line.
Versus the Homo sapiens agenda, and it is one of my favorite lines in the book.
Yes.
So
yes.
Unfortunately, we are like getting close to running out of time, and I'm sad because I literally have like 6 more questions, but I could hang out with you guys all day. Before we go, though, I want to celebrate somebody in our panel who has a book coming out on Tuesday.
Yay.
We want to say congratulations to you, George. You can't actually see my makeup, but I literally made up my face.
It's so pretty.
To match the cover of the book. So everybody make sure that you pick up All Boys Aren't Blue. Pre-order it. If you have not pre-order it now. If you're not going to pre-order it, make sure you get it on Tuesday.
Yes.
And support George. I think they have the signed copies at Blue Bicycle, right?
Yes.
With the book plates.
Yep.
So yeah, so if you order from Blue Bicycle, you can get it signed. And everybody support George's book.
Yeah.
To close us out, you have something, Josh?
Oh, I was going to say, we are also planning on doing a pre-order giveaway of 4 copies of All Boys Aren't Blue. So I'm going to post that. Of course, we're going to post that on Twitter after. So just look out for that. But we're really excited, and we're so excited for this book to be out in the world.
It's so good. Y'all not ready.
We're so excited for you, George. We're going to
Thank
take
you.
a picture here. And then
Smiling.
we also want to sing a happy book birthday to you.
Yes. What?
Happy book birthday to you.
Happy book birthday to you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all so much.
This is for you.
Thank y'all, for real. I appreciate it. It's tough releasing a book during a pandemic. You know, and it's really tough because like my grandmother Nanny, who I talk about so much in the book, just passed away in December, and so I was really fortunate that I was able to leave Brooklyn and move back in with my parents, which is a whole nother book. But I moved back in with my parents and was able to take care of her for the last 6 months of her life while she was fighting brain cancer. And so the book means even more now because I now have to tell her story, and it's tough and it's hard, but I think I'm very spiritual. So I know she had to, a woman as big as her had to become an ancestor for this book to come out and do what it needs to do. And so that's the easiest way that I can reconcile this. So thank you all for your support, and I hope everybody enjoys it and loves it and understands that the book is not just a story, but it's really spiritual and healing.
What's her name?
Louise Elder. So Louise Kennedy Evans Elder.
All right, to her. Here we go. Ready, everybody? 1, 2, 3.
Thank y'all. This was amazing.
Yes. If you all will each give one tip for teens specifically in quarantine.
Oh.
Okay, I'll go heavy with the heavy part. If you're like seriously, because like this has been like on my mind and weighing on my spirit. Like I know a lot of teens are in quarantine with people who are abusers. Please know that there are resources for you, that there are hotlines, that if you are in a situation where abuse is happening inside of your home, to not feel afraid to reach out to that friend, that best friend, your friend's mom, your friend, like a guardian outside of your home, to find a safe place to quarantine with them. It's just one of those things that a lot of us as queer people think about all the time is like safety. And I know like this is like a time where safety and abuse, and I've actually seen statistics of domestic violence as well as sexual abuse has risen since the quarantine. So just know there are resources and that there are people that you can reach out to that can reach out to the proper resources for you if you need to get out of an unsafe situation.
I'll go next. You don't have to do anything. That's my tip for everybody in quarantine. Like you're allowed to just kind of chill out. Yeah. I suck at writing right now, and I am A-okay with it.
I'll go. It's okay to struggle. That is just where it is for some of us right now. So if you're struggling, you're not alone. It's okay.
I'd say if you are in a place where you have a parent that you don't get to see very often, where this is a time that you wouldn't usually get, talk to them and ask questions about their past. If there's something about your relationship that is difficult or that you guys butt heads on, try to figure out a way to have those conversations, because this is, in some ways, if you are in a safe environment, this is precious time that we don't usually get to have. It's something that if you have the ability to take advantage of, it's something when you're older, you'll be glad you did.
They said it all.
I know. I'm trying to think. You know what? I like Bill's stay another day. You know, I'm going to be thinking about that. And as someone who works with young people, I think that's a beautiful hashtag and message. And especially during this time, I think new and old emotions are mixed up and everybody's trying to just figure out and move from one day to the next. So I love that. Stay another day. And stay another page. Read.
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 And there's no default emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Shout out to Becky Albertalli.
Well, thank you all for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
And I really do appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your experiences, not only with me, but with everybody who was here. So shout out to all of you, and y'all stay home.